Okay, welcome to the first mini lecture on the brain. As you can see, we will be covering many of the topics found in Chapter 14 of your textbook and Exercise 20 of your lab manuals, so those would be good resources to read as you prepare for the brain topic on the next exam. So like most lectures, we're going to start pretty general, talk about general functions of our brain, then we're going to divide the brain up into different anatomical regions, and then each of these regions is going to have a very distinct set of functions. We're nowhere near going to cover the depth in which we could when it comes to the brain. As you can imagine, it's very complicated. But we're going to touch on most of the big picture items, the basic regions of the brain and what those regions do. So the brain has many functions, we know that. It's going to be receiving a lot of information. So recall that we sense our external environment. We are constantly sensing our internal environments. So that sensory function is going to conduct information to the brain. So information that enters the brain can come from two areas. One, it can come up the spinal cord. So a lot of our senses go into the spinal cord, then up the spinal cord to the brain. And that up and down travel to and from the brain, if you recall, is done using the white matter of the spinal cord. But that's not the only way the brain can get information. It can also get information from cranial nerves. So cranial nerves, the name cranial means pertaining to the brain. So these are nerves that are directly attached to the brain. Many of these nerves are going to contain both sensory and motor neurons. So sensory is going to be bringing information in. Motor is going to be bringing information out. Some of these cranial nerves are strictly sensory, like your optic nerves, which are just bringing in visual information. Some of them are strictly motor, only controlling effectors. So this is how the brain gets all of its information, and then what it needs to do is interpret that information, organize that information, process that information, determine what that information means. So is it possibly chemicals in the blood? Maybe there's too much carbon dioxide or not enough oxygen. Well, the brain has to interpret that as meaning, okay, we need to get those levels back to normal, so maybe we need to increase our breathing rates. So it's an organizing and processing organ. It's going to store information, so I think we know that our memory is largely due to our brain. It's going to make decisions about sensory information, and it's going to take action. Some of these actions are going to be voluntary, like picking up your pencil, or involuntary, like regulating heart rate or respiratory rate. And then it also is where we find our intelligence, our emotions come from our brain, and our behaviors, our characteristics that our brain controls. So those are some of the basic functions. Let's take a look at the general structure. Well, first of all, it's a very important organ, so we need to protect it. So we protect our brain using a number of different tissues. One is meninges, 3 meninges, which again, we've learned about meninges because they surround the spinal cord. But these same 3 meninges cover and protect the brain. The brain's also protected by a clear fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid is produced inside the brain, and then it encircles the brain and travels through cavities within the brain. So cerebrospinal fluid is going to be a big topic in this PowerPoint. Where it comes from, where does it go, what does it do? Don't forget about the cranial bones that protect the brain. So we protect the brain with very rigid structures like bone. We protect the brain with softer tissue like the meninges. We also protect the brain with a fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. Your brain gets a lot of blood, so there's a lot of capillaries that are delivering nutrients and oxygen to our brain. So actually about 25% of the oxygen we breathe when we're at rest goes to the brain. So your brain requires a lot of nutrients and oxygen, and we know what those are for. Those are for the production of ATP. So the brain needs to produce a lot of ATP in order to generate all those action potentials and control all these major functions that we've talked about. Just like the spinal cord, the brain has gray matter and white matter. So we're going to look and notice that more of the outer layer to the brain, or superficial layer, is a lot of the gray matter, whereas inside the brain is more of the white matter. So almost opposite of what you see in the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord, you kind of see the gray matter towards the center and the white matter surrounding it. So the gray matter of the brain is going to be interpreting information, analyzing the information, whereas white matter is going to be transmitting action potentials into the brain, between different parts of the brain, out of the brain, just like the white matter of the spinal cord is transmitting up and down the spinal cord. Okay, so the next video we're going to start our discussions on different regions of the brain. And there's really 4 major portions or regions. And then each of these regions we have to get more specific. So some of these regions have subregions. And these subregions each have their own function. So where the general regions include the brain stem, which is almost like a continuation of the spinal cord, the cerebellum, which has a number of functions dedicated to it, the diencephalon, which is basically in the center of the brain, and then the cerebrum, which is the majority of the brain that kind of surrounds a lot of the diencephalon. So these are the 3 regions or portions of the brain we're going to cover in the upcoming lectures.